I'm going to start by this first slide showing you my face so you get to know at least a little bit of what I look like. Um, However, I'm going to revert to just audio for the remaining slides in this section and probably subsequent sections, just because when I convert this over to a YouTube format that's easy for you to access, easier for you to access if you don't use VoiceThread, that way my face is not blocking any of the slides. So just as an introduction, I wanted you to be able to see me, but what I'm going to do for today is I'm going to spend some time discussing the horse's gastrointestinal tract. I think a working knowledge of the tract is really necessary in order to decide whether a particular feedstuff um, is going to work well in a horse's ration or not. Um, when I do that, I first have to ask myself whether the horse's gastrointestinal tract can digest and absorb the nutrients that's in that particular feedstuff. And if the answer is yes, the second question that needs to be answered is how best to provide that feedstuff um, so that the horse's well-being isn't compromised. We're going to cover information on design of the gastrointestinal tract, its function, including where the processes of digestion and absorption occur, um, and along with that, we'll cover the idiosyncrasies. You all know, as people interested in horse nutrition, that the horse's GI tract has little idiosyncrasies. Um, but which one of those allow us to make um, informed choices? Like, how do we factor in those idiosyncrasies to make sure that we're not compromising the horse's well-being in any way with our choice of feedstuffs? So, with that, I'll go ahead and proceed. Take out my picture, but you'll hear my voice. Okay, so I've already probably confused you since my second slide is a take-home message slide, but I want you to be thinking about what I consider the take-home messages are right from the start. As I cover different aspects of the GI tract, how it's designed, how it works, its idiosyncrasies, I want you to relate each topic back to these take-home messages, namely the adult horse. Notice that I emphasize adult. We'll talk about feeding young stock later. The adult horse's ration would consist primarily of quality forage, which will meet its energy and protein requirements, while maintaining gastrointestinal tract health by stimulating passage of foodstuffs through the tract and sustaining the microorganism population in the hindgut. The gastrointestinal tract is also known as the GI tract, the digestive tract, or depending upon the age of the literature you're reading or the person you're talking to, the alimentary canal, or quite simply the gut. I tend to use all those terms fairly interchangeably, but I will try to um, limit myself to just calling it the gastrointestinal tract. The gastrointestinal tract of the horse is essentially a muscular tube. It propels feed down the tube and, along with its contents, facilitates the digestion of feedstuffs and allows for the absorption of nutrients. So you can see this is supposed to be grass. I drew down here. It comes in through the mouth, it gets ingested, travels down the esophagus. But you can see it's really representing a tube, and the green represents the grass that's being broken down and allowed to cross the gastrointestinal tract barrier. But the contents of the tube itself is really outside of the body. So you can have feedstuff that travels down the tube and back out without ever actually ending the body proper, never leaving that tube. That tube really serves as that selective barrier. It separates the outside of the body from the inside of the body. So when I traced that feedstuff, grass in this case, you can see it enters the mouth, went through the GI tract, all the way to the end, exit the body as feces, and was never used by the horse. It isn't until feedstuffs are digested or broken down into components that they can be absorbed across the wall of the tube. So feedstuffs, as they're taken in, even when they're chewed quite carefully, are still in such a complex structure that it is not possible for them to cross that selective physical barrier made up of by the gut wall. It's a way of protecting. So the feed stuff has to be broken down into small components, identified as something that's allowed to cross, and then actively or passively allowed to cross that barrier. They're then taken up by the horse's tissues and used, and those tissues could be the muscle, liver, heart, or whatever. The design of the horse's gastrointestinal tract is one of a simple, single compartment stomach, here, a narrow, small intestine, here, and an enlarged region where microbial fermentation occurs. Because microbial fermentation takes place after the feedstuff has passed through the stomach, the horse is known as a hindgut fermenter. This is quite different than a ruminant gastrointestinal tract found in cattle and sheep and goats, where fermentation occurs prior to the feedstuffs entering the stomach. Consequently, not all feedstuffs that work well for ruminants work well for horses, and vice versa. The horse's gastrointestinal tract can be divided into two major parts. You have the foregut and the hindgut. In the foregut, you have the mouth, the esophagus, the stomach, and the small intestine. In the hindgut, you have the cecum, the large colon, the small colon, and the rectum. In the foregut, the horse produces enzymes that can break down or digest some feedstuffs. So this is the area of the foregut, and the horse's tissues make enzymes that it secretes that is capable of breaking down feedstuffs into smaller components. In the hindgut, the enzymes that break down feedstuffs are produced by the microbes. Microbes such as bacteria, protozoa, and fungi. They produce enzymes that break down feedstuffs that had not been digested in the foregut. Now, they can't break down everything, but they don't even get a shot at any of the feedstuffs until after the feedstuff has passed through the foregut, where the horse's enzymes get first shot at it. Microbial. Let me see if I can draw this. Does that look like a 2? It's supposed to be a 2. Second shot at it. You can think of digestion in the horse's gastrointestinal tract as having and needing a two-pronged approach. Enzymes produced by the horse's own tissues in the foregut and in combination with enzymes produced by the microbes in the hindgut, work in concert. Enzymes produced in both regions of the gastrointestinal tract are able to reduce and or convert feedstuffs into nutrients that are small enough and have the correct chemical structure to cross the selective gastrointestinal tract wall barrier and enter the horse's body itself, where they can be used. If the feedstuff cannot be digested or converted, they simply continue on through that gastrointestinal tract tube that we talked about previously and are eliminated in the feces, never having entered the horse's body proper at all. Here you see the image of how all the parts of the gastrointestinal tract actually fit within the horse, starting at the mouth, ending at the anus, with everything else packaged carefully in what appears to be the too small a space of the abdominal cavity. You can also see in the image at the top the average capacity of each portion of the tract of an approximately 1,000-pound horse. Importantly, the capacity of the different portions of the tract and the rate of passage of feedstuffs through the tract affects not only the amount of feedstuff a horse can eat, but also the extent of digestion which can occur, which in turn affects the amount of nutrients that are absorbed. Feed is digested or broken down or converted in a series of sequential steps. Ideally, the feed is digested in the region where the nutrients released can also be absorbed. However, if feed moves too quickly through the tract, some of those sequential steps don't have time to happen, and so absorption can't happen. Instead, the partially digested feedstuff, or the parts that aren't absorbed, even if they could be, continue on down the gastrointestinal tract tube. In a different region, even if additional digestion takes place, it may not be a region of the gastrointestinal tract where that particular nutrient can be absorbed. In other words, things have to fit properly. The feedstuff needs to be digested so that it can be absorbed. The feedstuffs may have missed the window of opportunity to be used by the horse if those two conditions aren't met. Consequently, the horse's relatively small stomach and narrow small intestine works best when the horse is able to eat small meals, forage-based meals ideally, on an almost continuous basis, or what is also known as trickle feeding. I say for myself it's sort of like snacking throughout the day. That's what a horse wants to do, snack throughout the day. Likewise, it works best if the feedstuffs are retained long enough in each region of the gastrointestinal tract for digestion by the enzymes in those regions to do their job. If you feed too much too quickly, it tends to help push feedstuffs through the tract, and it may not reside in a location long enough for complete digestion and therefore subsequent absorption to occur. How long feed remains within the different portions of the gastrointestinal tract varies based on the particle size and digestibility, with pelleted feeds moving the fastest through the tract, followed by vegetative pasture, and lastly by dried forages. The goal to optimize feedstuff utilization is to retain the feedstuff in the gastrointestinal tract long enough for both digestion and absorption to occur. So what are some of the other factors that affect digestion besides gastrointestinal tract capacity and the rate of passage? One of the key components of digestion is the reduction of the feedstuff to a small size. The smaller, the better. And while doing so, exposing more of the surface area to those digestive enzymes gives them a better chance to do their job in the time that they have available. So how does the horse, aside from enzymatic digestion, reduce the size of the feed? Good question. The horse will use its lips, its incisor teeth, and its tongue to grasp food and take it into its mouth. Using predominantly the tongue, it will then push the feed to the back of the mouth, where its molar teeth grind the feed into smaller pieces. Once chewed, the base of the tongue pushes the food past the soft palate into the pharynx, which connects the mouth to the esophagus. You can see in the simplified cartoon images in the upper right that the horse can either swallow or it can breathe, but it can't do both at the same time. When the bolus of food reaches the pharynx, the soft palate lifts, closes off the nasal cavity, while the epiglottis, which is attached to the entrance of the larynx, closes off the trachea, and the food is swallowed into the esophagus. That's the green path that you see in the cartoon on the left. Once swallowed, the soft palate lowers, the epiglottis lifts, and the horse is able to breathe again, which is what you see in the blue passage on the cartoon on the right. To be effective, chewing requires that the feed is trapped between the upper and lower teeth, where vertical and lateral movements crush and tear the feedstuff into smaller and smaller pieces. So, how small is small? It's very important that the feedstuff be reduced in size, since the horse cannot regurgitate its food from its stomach back into its mouth to be chewed again, the way, say, a ruminant like a cow or a sheep can do it. You see them, they eat, they lay down a little bit later, they're chewing again, even though they haven't taken any more feed because they've regurgitated it back into their mouth, and they can repeat that process. A horse can't do that. Also, there is very little in the way of microbial fermentation that occurs in the horse's stomach. So the only means the horse has to reduce the feed particle size to something manageable by the digestive enzymes that are present in the small intestine, the ones the horse makes itself, is by thorough chewing. During the chewing process, saliva production is stimulated. The horse can produce a lot of saliva, 9 to 10 gallons of saliva each day when it's consuming a dry forage, which is more than it would produce if it was consuming pasture or cereal grains. It takes a lot more chewing to reduce forage to small pieces compared to, say, pelleted feeds or cereal grains. The slower a feed is consumed, the more the saliva is produced. The saliva moistens the feedstuff, making swallowing easier, and since it has a pH somewhat above neutral, it is also able to buffer the acidic pH of the stomach secretions. And just a note, for those of you who haven't been thinking about a pH scale for a while, in simplest terms, pH is on a log scale used to measure acidity or the base of a solution. The scale runs from 0 to 14, with 7 representing neutrality. Any value below 7 is acidic, and the lower the number, the more acidic. So a value of 1 on the pH scale is similar to something like battery acid. And any value above 7 is basic, with the higher numbers being more basic. A value of 13 to 14 on the pH scale would be similar to lye. Since pH uses a log scale, each whole pH value change represents a tenfold difference. So a pH of 4 is 10 times more acidic than a pH of 5, while a pH of 8 is 10 times more basic than a pH of 7. If a horse is consuming a ration low in forages and high in grains, less saliva is produced, less buffering occurs in the stomach, and the pH is lower or more acidic than when a high forage, low grain ration is eaten. A low pH constitutes a risk factor for gastric ulcers. We've seen how upper and lower jaws work to grind feed using both a lateral movement and a vertical movement. The amount of occlusion between the upper and lower teeth changes with the orientation of the head. While it can be a bit frustrating when you own a horse that is a slow, careful chewer and you just want them to hurry up, but those horses will be able to utilize much more of the nutrients in the feedstuff by optimizing the opportunity for digestive enzymes to break down the feedstuff. On the other hand, if you have a quick, careless chewer that consumes their feed very quickly, usually most evident when they are eating grain, those horses tend to swallow larger particle size of feed or bolt their feed and are able to get much less nutrients out of that particular feedstuff at a time. The horse that bolts its feed risks lodging a food bolus in its esophagus. The feed should move by peristalsis all the way to the stomach very quickly. So kind of in waves of contraction of the muscles, kind of pushing the feed bolus down the esophagus and into the stomach, kind of like the way you would squeeze toothpaste out of a toothpaste tube. If the feed moves only part way down the esophagus and it becomes stuck, here you can see an image of a bolus of food in the upper right-hand corner of this slide. It can't go down, it can't go up. The horse cannot eat anything else, nor can it drink. Recall from the earlier slide that although the horse may not be able to eat, it can still breathe. So it's not like a person who gets food stuck in its throat who also can't breathe, because this is stuck much further down in the esophagus. It's not up by the pharynx. You can see in the line drawing to the right a characteristic stance of a horse suffering from choke. You may have seen this personally. The horse is standing with its head and neck outstretched, trying to relieve the pressure and the discomfort. Frequently, it also has its head lowered, maybe dripping nasal discharge as feed eaten after the esophagus has become blocked is forced up past the soft palate. And because of the way the structure of the mouth and nasal nares, the partially lubricated, saliva-coated feed stuff is going to actually be pushed through the nasal cavity and out, since it can't be swallowed. The horse that is choking is almost immediately uncomfortable, and if the condition persists, it can become downright painful. And if not resolved, the situation can actually be deadly. Besides eating too quickly, poor dentation can interfere with the mastication of feed, especially forages which require the most mastication. If a horse's incisors become overlong, they can prevent the cheek teeth from touching. You can see that here in one of the photos. When that happens, you're promoting development of a wavy, grinding surface with sharp hooks that can injure the soft membranes in the mouth, making chewing actually painful, and horses will actually stop eating because it hurts too much to chew. Or there might simply not be enough tooth left in the aged horse, where with constant eruption the teeth are essentially used up, maybe by the time they're, 30, 25 or 30 or 35, depends on the horse. You might see quitting, where the horse attempts to chew the forage, mangles it around, adds a lot of saliva, is not able to reduce it much in size, so that when it's swallowed, it's difficult to swallow, so it falls out of the horse's mouth. Very little or no nutrition is gained in the process. Impaired mastication is also a risk factor for impaction colic. Too large pieces of feed can become stuck much lower in the GI tract, such as in the ileocecal junction, where that small intestine tube of the foregut, actually connects with the cecum in the beginning of the hindgut. Those openings between the two are fairly close proximity to each other, and you can actually get blockage occurring. Once swallowed, assuming that choke hasn't occurred, the feed moves down the esophagus, which is a long muscular tube, about 50 to 60 inches long in the adult horse, and connecting the mouth-pharynx region to the stomach. Food can only move in that one direction, down the esophagus to the stomach, because the valve of the esophagus, and there's a directionality to the peristaltic movement. Well, keep in mind, as I mentioned, the horse cannot regurgitate and it cannot vomit. Once voluntarily swallowed, feedstuff moves down into the stomach. That sphincter has to open for the feed to exit the esophagus and enter the stomach. The stomach is, as we've said, relatively small in relationship to the size of the rest of the horse's gastrointestinal tract. Its overall size as an animal. Moreover, because of its kind of J shape and the orientation it has in the abdominal cavity, it tends to fill about 2/3 full before the lower pyloric sphincter opens and allows the stomach contents to exit the stomach and enter the small intestine. If for some reason the stomach overfills with feed, as in a grain overload, like your pony gets loose in the middle of the night, gets into the grain bin and eats and eats and eats, then the stomach can become distended, or if there's a lot of gases build up, it also can become distended. The distension can include the small intestine as well. Both instances are painful for the horse, resulting in signs of abdominal discomfort or colic. Initially, as pieces of feedstuffs enter the stomach, they settle into the strata or layers based on their density, with the higher density pieces such as grain or pellets settling to the bottom. So in the image in your upper right hand corner, you see a high density liquid and small particles in tan at the bottom of the stomach, kind of that cross-sectional area of the stomach you see. Whereas larger, lighter density pieces such as forage tends to float on the top. So you see that light green low density mat that actually sits on the top of the fluid in the stomach. As the larger lower density pieces break down into smaller pieces, as they get reduced somewhat in size, they'll settle over time to a lower and lower strata in that stomach fluid. While there isn't a lot of fluid in the stomach of a horse that hasn't eaten for some time, when eating, the fluid present in the stomach is made up of a combination of stomach secretions, including hydrochloric acid, and digestive enzyme solutions, and the saliva that was produced and swallowed during the chewing process, and any water that a horse has drunk. What you'll see if you watch a horse eat, he'll chew, take a bite of forage, chew for a little bit, get a sip of water, chew for a little bit, get a sip of water, so it all kind of becomes mixed and forms that stomach fluid. Because acid is secreted in the lower portion of the stomach, down low where the high density particles tend to settle, down again in that tan region, and the saliva that enters the esophagus is at the top, enters where close to that low density mat or even the medium density mat. Then the lower portion of the stomach has a pH that may run from 1 to 2 near the bottom, whereas the pH near the upper regions or the low density mat may have a pH of 7, being neither acidic nor basic because of the benefit that they're getting from the saliva that's being swallowed. There are some acid-loving microorganisms that reside in the horse's stomach that can thrive in that kind of conditions. They do not appear to be responsible for much digestion of feedstuffs, probably because there's just not very many, and the time they are in contact with the feed is pretty limited. The transit time through the stomach is usually pretty fast. There may be microorganisms associated with the feed that are, in fact, there probably are inevitably, microorganisms associated with the feed that was introduced when the feed was eaten. So it actually was on the feedstuffs when the horse ate it, but most or all would not be expected to survive that low pH of the stomach. In fact, that is one of the protective mechanisms of the low pH in the horse's stomach that it would kill microorganisms coming in that should not be there, that might have kind of gotten a free ride coming in on feedstuffs. The horse's stomach is divided into four regions that you see here: the esophageal or cardiac region, um, the area of the margoplicatus, the fundic region, and the pyloric region. The portion closest to where the esophagus enters the stomach is known as the esophageal or cardiac region. It's non-glandular, or in other words, does not produce any secretions. The second portion is the fundic region, um, and it's divided from the esophageal region by the margoplicatus. The differences between those regions and the location of the margoplicatus is very clear even to the unaided eye. You can see in the photograph the whitish or light pink region, the esophageal region, and the much darker pink fundic region. Where one region ends and the other begins is known as the margoplicatus. You should just ignore that bot that is present in the image, because that's just happened to be an image that I thought best showed the differences in the non-glandular and the glandular region. The fundic region is the main portion of the stomach. It is glandular, produces acid and digestive enzymes, as well as the mucus secretions that coat the lining of the stomach and help protect it from those acid secretions. The small population of microbes that reside in the stomach are able to utilize the feedstuff and as a byproduct produce volatile fatty acids, which can be absorbed in a very limited quantity by the horse for its own use. The pyloric region is the region that connects the stomach to the small intestine. Again, acid um, and some enzyme secretions occur there for limited digestions, predominantly of proteins, and there is going to be some volatile fatty acid absorption. It's the pyloric region which regulates the feedstuff exiting the stomach and entering the small intestine. One of the problems associated with horse's stomach is ulcers. The horse stomach continually, and I mean 24/7, produces acid, hydrochloric acid, even when it isn't eating. It can produce up to 9 gallons of acid a day, more when it is eating, less when it isn't. So there's more acid production when the animal is eating, when your horse is eating, but even when it's not eating, there is some acid that's being produced. The production of acid occurs in the lower portions of the stomach, as we've mentioned. If the entire stomach is empty of feed, because it has been, 5 or more hours since the last time the horse had anything to eat, it is at an increased risk for ulcers. And that's because when there's food, especially lighter, larger pieces of forage which float on top of the stomach fluid, that mat of food minimizes sloshing of the acid which is produced on the fundic or lower regions from coming into contact with the esophageal region, the upper portion of the stomach, which does not have much in the way of protection against the acid. So when we talked about the fundic region being non-glandular, really part of that important glandular function is the production of mucus, which kind of coats the surface and serves as a physical barrier between the acidic secretions and the cells themselves. And you don't have that up in the esophageal region. Consequently, most ulcers which occur in the esophageal region do so just around the margoplicatus, just in that region. As you can see in this image, you have the dark pink on the lower right hand, which is the fundic region, and you have the whitish light pink, which is the esophageal region, and you can see those areas of irritation and actually rupture of that cell layer, or actually the formation of ulcers that have occurred there. There are protective mechanisms for the intestinal lining. There's specialized cell membranes. There's going to be some bicarbonate buffers to neutralize the acidity. As I mentioned before, mucus secretions to form a physical barrier between the mucosa lining and the acid in the fundic region. However, the horse's gastrointestinal tract is really designed for small, very frequent meals throughout the day and night. And while the protective mechanisms work well under those conditions, they may not be sufficient when the horse is meal fed with maybe 8 to 10 to 12 hours between meals. So if you feed the horse in the morning before you go to work, which is 6:30 in the morning. You don't feed him again until you get home in the evening, which is 6:30 in the evening. It took them 2 to 3 hours to eat. They go through a big chunk of time without much food, if any, in part of their stomach. In one study, this is an older study now, but I think it's been repeated a number of times. 75% of the horses that were fed 2 times a day at 12-hour intervals had ulcers. So 75% of the horses fed that meat that way had ulcers. Whereas when fed 3 times a day, 58% of the horses had ulcers. And that still seems like a lot. I know, 58%, but compared to 75, it's an improvement. Feeding intervals are only one of the known risk factors for ulcers. The rate of cell growth in the gastrointestinal tract is very rapid, and as a result, even though ulcers can develop in just a matter of days, they can also heal quickly, depending on how severe they are. With proper treatment, the stomach can regenerate healthy lining, maybe as soon as a month. Again, it depends on just how significant the ulcers are. Ideally, horses would have food, snack on, trickle feeding, frequent snacking, always have forage in the stomach. The small intestine is made up of 3 parts: the duodenum or duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. The duodenum is the portion about 3 feet long connected to the stomach. It in turn is connected to the 70-foot jejunum, and finally the 5 feet of ileum, which connects to the cecum in the hindgut. This is all for an adult horse, about a 1,000-pound horse. Because it is so long, although narrow in diameter, the small intestine has to be folded just so to fit. It is arranged in a series of folds and coils suspended from the loin region by mesentery. An example of the mesentery you can see in the lower left-hand corner of the slide. Transit time through the small intestine varies with the feedstuff, but is in general fairly rapid, typically lasting between 1 and 8 hours. Granted, that range of transit is quite broad, but it depends a lot on the form of the feedstuff, how much is being fed, whether it's being continually pushed kind of through the tract because the animals continually eat, etc. The small intestine is the primary site for digestion and absorption of starch, which is broken into sugars, proteins, which are broken into amino acids, and fats, which are broken into fatty acids that the horse can use directly. The small intestine creates the environment compatible for the horse's own enzymes to be able to digest or break down feedstuffs. It does so in a series of sequential steps, resulting in nutrients that are selectively absorbed across the lining or tube wall of the small intestine. The difficulty arises if there is insufficient enzymes produced and or time allowed for them to digest that feedstuff. When could that happen? If, for example, the horse has access to too much grain at one time. I already used the pony that gets out in the middle of the night as an example. A pony will overwhelm the small intestine's enzyme capacity, the capacity to break down the starch in the grain to simple sugars that in turn can be absorbed in the small intestine. Certainly some of it will be digested and absorbed there, but some, maybe a lot of it, will actually overflow the small intestine and end up in the hindgut. You recall that I said that the small intestine is the primary site for the digestion and absorption of sugar and starch, proteins, amino acids, and fatty acids that the horse can use directly. That is true, but I have to emphasize the phrase and digestion and absorption, digestion and absorption. While the microbes in the hindgut will readily digest starch and protein and fat that comes their way, the nutrients cannot be absorbed by the horse per se in any appreciable quantities. Instead, the microbes make use of those nutrients for themselves. With that said, it is very important to provide the necessary nutrients to the microbes, but you don't want to be feeding proteins and fats and sugars and starches to the horse with the idea that the horse is directly benefiting from them and find out later that they did not, and also that you're feeding the microbes in such a way that is not conducive to their well-being, which in turn can cause the horse a lot of difficulties. I want to spend just a minute or so getting you oriented to this figure. You notice in the bottom right-hand corner of the figure, there's the abbreviation CR. That would be cranial. That would be toward the head. And the opposite end of that double-sided arrow is CAU, or caudal. That would be the tail. L left and R right. So the horse is really facing to the right, sideways in this image. The upper portion of the figure where you see the right dorsal colon and the left dorsal colon, kind of that mustard milky color and that kind of dark teal color. You can see that forms kind of a U, and underneath that U is another U made up of the ventral colon, both left and right. And that's connected to the cecum. Small intestine coming in from the lower left into the cecum. Feedstuffs moves through the right ventral colon to the left ventral colon, makes a turn, left dorsal colon makes a turn, right dorsal colon, and then exits to the transverse colon and the descending colon. Okay, so you kind of got that image in mind of how the horse is and where that fits inside. The large colon in the abdominal cavity is held in place by its attachment at the beginning where it connects to the cecum. I showed you where the cecum and the right ventral column connect. And at the end, near the descending colon. But in between, those double U's are really freely movable. They're kind of held in place by their bulk, by the fact that they fill the space, and it's hard to kind of shift them around, although that certainly can happen, especially in the cases of, say, gas distension. The arrangement is such that the large colon takes what essentially amounts to 180-degree turns. So you know the right dorsal colon, 180-degree flexure to the left dorsal colon, and the same thing happens on the ventral colon. And while it changes directions, almost 180 degrees, you also see a simultaneous and drastic reduction in diameter. Each of those physical characteristics are risk factors. So you change direction, you change diameter, you go big to little, little to big, 180-degree turns, sort of like a hairpin loop going down a mountain. The cecum and the ventral colons have sacculated regions, which where you see is made up of those kind of bulges along the surface, outer surface of the right ventral and left ventral colon. And they kind of resemble a series of incomplete pouches. There are bands of muscles that run around or circumferentially around the colon, and there's also some that run longitudinally along the length of the colon. And it's a combination of those sacculations and muscle contractions. They kind of squeeze, and peristaltic contractures move it through, and then it squeezes and then moves it through. And so what you have is a series of mixing regions, each one of those sacculations. And in those you have ingesta or digesta or chyme or whatever you want to call it, is retained for a period of time within each of those outpouchings, where it enhances the digestive enzymes that come into contact with that feedstuffs, and also brings that digested feedstuffs into contact with the hindgut. So the hindgut's pretty large diameter, right? Think of how small the small intestine was, that little yellow tube on the bottom left-hand corner. But in the hindgut, it's a much larger diameter. So for nutrients that have been digested into their smaller components, for them to be absorbed, they actually have to come into contact with that the tube lining, the tube wall. And if they're in the middle of that lumen, absorption can't occur. So you need movement, you need contractions, you need to kind of mix that digest around so that those digested feedstuffs can come into physical contact with the GI tract wall to allow for absorption to happen. Ingesta leaves the ileum, or the last segment of the small intestine, enters that cecum, which along with the large colon are those large fermentation vats. Literally billions of microorganisms produce enzymes that break down the structural fibrous components of the diet, such as cellulose and hemicellulose, which are components that cannot be digested in the small intestine, by the way. However, not all of the structural components can be digested by the microbes. Those that cannot, such as, say, lignin, are eliminated in the feces. Remember, those are the feedstuffs that go all the way through the tube, don't ever enter the body, and end up being eliminated in the fecal material. When the microorganisms enzymatically digest the fibrous components, they produce volatile fatty acids as byproducts. Those volatile fatty acids, they can be absorbed through the cell wall of the cecum and the colon of the hindgut, and they can be used by the horse as an energy source. The size of the cecum and the large colon reflect the amount of time that is required for fermentation to take place. Feedstuffs that are partially digested may be in the large intestine for short periods of time, but usually they're in there for 36 to 48 hours. While some of it depends a lot on the feedstuffs and a lot of what else is going on. While some of the protein present in the forage can be digested and absorbed in the foregut, much of it ends up in the hindgut. The microbial degradation of dietary proteins does not produce amino acids the horse can use. Remember, I mentioned that. Instead, the microbial degradation of dietary proteins results in the production of ammonia, which is used by the microbes to produce the proteins they need for growth, and nitrogen, which can be absorbed across the gut wall. There are nutrients that the horse can use that are absorbed across the hind gut wall. As I've mentioned, volatile fatty acids can be used for an energy supply. In fact, they're the primary source of energy in the horse's ration, or should be. Vitamin K, which is produced by the microbes, can also be absorbed and utilized by the horse. And importantly, water moves into and out of the hindgut depending upon osmotic pressure to maintain hydration of the horse. The microbial population of the hindgut is specific to the horse and its diet. There's a balance of various types of microbes that work well together. If, however, as an example I gave you earlier, a pony has sudden access to that cereal grains in excess of its ability of the small intestine to digest and absorb the sugars, that excess starch can overflow into the cecum and large colon. The sudden change, pony not used to having a lot of cereal grains that end up in the hindgut, that sudden change then can result in pain and gas as well as diarrhea. The atypical influx of starch causes starch-loving microbial population, which are usually in pretty minimal numbers in a horse not fed a lot of starch, to quickly flourish. Like, oh, happy days, we're getting what we want to eat, and so they double quickly. As a side effect, the pH in the hindgut is lowered, and so it becomes more acidic, from maybe an optimal pH of 6.8 down to 6.2 or 6.0, or even lower, resulting in hindgut acidosis, causing the plant fiber-loving microbe population to quickly die. So the microbes that would normally be digesting and utilizing cellulose or hemicellulose, they can't survive in that low pH, and so they die. So you have the starch-loving microbes flourish, the fiber-loving microbes are dying, pieces of that dead bacteria act as endotoxins. The cellulose-loving microbes that are dying act as endotoxins. The integrity of the hindgut wall is damaged by the low pH and the presence of these endotoxins, and endotoxins leak across what should have been a selective physical barrier, and those endotoxins get into the horse's body proper, and now that horse is in trouble. Once ingesta exit the large colon, it enters the small colon and ultimately the rectum. Both water and some mineral absorption occurs in the small colon with the formation of fecal balls. The rectum is responsible for storage and expulsion of fecal balls. There are situations where sometimes you have horses, I don't know if it's more often in older horses, I guess that's the ones I'm most experienced with, where they have kind of watery feces. It's like they don't reabsorb as much water, or there's some issues. People can try all sorts of things, some with limited success, I would think. And there's a couple different things that could be going on there, and it's sometimes can be very difficult to sort out. It might be that absorption of water, reabsorption of water is made difficult. It could be that absorption of other components is reduced, which increases osmotic pressure, which increases the water retention in the colon and rectum, which makes the feces watery. There's a lot of different possibilities there. In review, the design of the horse's gastrointestinal tract is made up of a long tube which has changing diameters, coils and folds held sometimes in place only by its own bulk. The gut wall serves as a selective barrier between the outside and the inside of the horse. The horse's gastrointestinal tract is home to a large microbial population that resides predominantly in the hindgut. The function of the gastrointestinal tract is to take in feedstuffs, move them along the tract so that digestion and absorption can occur. The capacity of the foregut in the horse is small compared to the hindgut, which affects which feedstuffs it can effectively use. Acid is being produced continuously in the stomach, which is, if otherwise empty, is a risk factor for ulcers. The mixed population of microbes in the hindgut is sensitive to abrupt changes in what is available to them. A sudden change can alter the ratio of microbes, which in turn can negatively impact the environment of the microbes that can live there, which in turn can damage the integrity of the selective barrier of the gut wall. The horse's gastrointestinal tract is designed to make use of a forage-based ration provided on an almost continuous basis, which is something to keep in mind when formulating your horse's ration. So what are the most important pieces of information that I can think you should take away? Based on the design of the horse's gastrointestinal tract and the way it works, forage should be the foundation for the adult horse's ration. In many, even most instances, when provided free choice or as frequent meals, quality forage will provide all the energy and the protein the horse needs. It will also provide the fiber and bulk that suits the overall design of the gastrointestinal tract, and assuming that the type of forage isn't changed abruptly, will facilitate and sustain the critically important microorganism population in the horse's hindgut. In instances where high quality forage is limited, or um, the horse's performance requirements or physiological status is such that forages can't be sufficient, are not sufficient in and of themselves, then the addition of other feedstuffs may well be necessary.